Hi there. I hope you're well this week. Before we dig into Reggie Williams for the first time together, let's recap. Module thesis, which you can see on the slide, is Bonhoeffer's theological transformation in Harlem provides an example for racial reconciliation in our day. In order to give substance to that thesis in this video, you will attempt to perform 4 small but significant tasks. First, you'll establish basic context for Reggie Williams and his subject Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Second, you'll analyze the differences that Williams sees between Bonhoeffer's Volk theology, his theology of his people, and the Bonhoeffer that emerged from his experiences in Harlem. Third, you will interpret Williams's argument concerning the ways the Harlem Renaissance shaped Bonhoeffer's theology into one of incarnation and empathy in the next chapter. Fourth, you will evaluate Williams' analyses in his third chapter of W.E.B. Du Bois's short manifesto Credo and his parable Jesus Christ in Texas, as well as County Cullen's evocative empathic poem The Black Christ, in terms of their import for Bonhoeffer's new paradigm of racial reconciliation. All right, let's begin with our first goal, basic context for Bonhoeffer and Williams. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, pictured on the slide, was a German Lutheran pastor, systematic theologian, ethicist, and member of the German resistance to the Nazi regime. He was born in February of 06 into a wealthy family, 1906 for clarity. He was the 6th of 8 children. His twin sister Sabine was the 7th. Apparently, Bonhoeffer did what's called a Staatsexamen, a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in one, in theology, at the University of Tübingen, and then got his doctorate, his first of 2, at the age of 21 in Berlin, also in theology. And as Williams is about to explain at great depth, Bonhoeffer spent a year in Harlem, New York City, in 1930 and 31 doing a postdoctoral degree. That year was seminal for Bonhoeffer for reasons that we will explain. Now, after this time in Harlem, Bonhoeffer co-founded the Confessing Church, an ecclesial instrument of the resistance, by way of the Barmen Declaration in 1933 and 34. Bonhoeffer also ran an underground seminary in Finkenwalde and became involved with the German resistance to the Nazi regime through the Abwehr, or Military Intelligence Office, and was eventually arrested by the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, in April of 1943. Bonhoeffer was imprisoned first in Tegel military prison, then in Flossenburg concentration camp, and finally hanged in April of 1945, just weeks before the Allied forces liberated the camp and Nazism collapsed in Germany. Meanwhile, Reggie L. Williams, pictured here, teaches ethics at McCormick Theological Seminary here in Chicago. Williams was trained at Westmont College and at Fuller Theological Seminary, particularly earning a master's degree in theology from Fuller in 06 and completing his PhD in Christian ethics from Fuller in 2011. The text we'll be reading through, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, won a Choice Outstanding Title Award in 2015 in the area of religion. As you'll hopefully be able to see, that award is well-deserved because Williams' analysis of Bonhoeffer's initial racism and the ways that Bonhoeffer's views changed through his exposure to Harlem is very cogent. Dr. Williams serves on the board of directors for the Society of Christian Ethics, as well as the International Dietrich Bonhoeffer Society and other organizations as well. All of that is goal 1. Our second goal is exploring the intro and more cogently the first chapter of Williams' text and analyzing the difference that Williams sees between Bonhoeffer's Volk theology and his early period and the Bonhoeffer that emerged from his experiences in Harlem thereafter. So chapters 1 through 3 read a bit more like a history of Bonhoeffer than an attempt to theologize, but there are 3 theologically significant aspects of Williams' retelling of Bonhoeffer's early theology that will impact our narrative of faith as an episteme that allows us to do theology. First big claim that Williams makes in his intro is that Bonhoeffer's unique theology was formed explicitly by his experiences in Harlem and his subsequent resistance to the Nazi regime. According to Williams, Bonhoeffer's interpretation of the way of Jesus is connected to justice, and justice is born of empathy, the sharing of experience with others. What matters, according to Williams, is one's interpretation of Christ-likeness. Williams' second big idea, also available on the slide, is that his theological study with Adolf von Harnack and others in Berlin exposed Bonhoeffer to what he calls a theology of sociality that emphasized the revelation of God in the person of Jesus. That said, Bonhoeffer's relational theology was also infused with the love of his Volk, his people. He believed in the doctrine of two kingdoms, one the civil nation-state, the other the kingdom of grace, ruled by Christ alone. This meant that for the early Bonhoeffer, social action was hubris, and that one's love of enemy can never overcome one's love for one's Volk, or people. Does that sound odd to you? It should sound odd to us, at this point, because according to Williams anyway, the early Bonhoeffer is contradicting not only the Jesus we may be most familiar with in the Sermon on the Mount, but also Cone's vision of Jesus as a liberator explicitly and steadfastly in solidarity with particular groups of oppressed people, Quoke's paradigm of Christ as a porous, non-binary figure complicating the boundaries of whiteness, and even Asasi Diaz's ideal of the episteme that expresses a particular mode of knowing and being in the world. This blood and soil Bonhoeffer, this version of Bonhoeffer, is full of both conviction and contradiction, because he proclaims a relational and social gospel that is emptied of its power by his nationalism. Because his discourse is so nationalistic, it's devoid of a love of difference. Which brings us to the third big idea in Williams' first chapter. Williams observes that Bonhoeffer's experience in Harlem destroyed and reformed his Volk-inflected theology, as we'll see. After Bonhoeffer decided to move to New York City and take up his postdoc at Union, he discovered to his chagrin that no white churches in Harlem gave evidence of social justice in their theology, their preaching, or their communal life. At high-class Union, Christ, culture, and civilization were nearly synonymous, or appeared that way to Bonhoeffer anyway. At which point, cue one Albert Frank Fisher. Al Fisher was a black student at Union, and a descendant of black Baptist preachers born in Alabama in 1908. Now Fisher took Bonhoeffer to his uncle's church, Abyssinian Baptist, in the core of Harlem. That church was aflame with the social gospel and was one hub for the Harlem Renaissance, an artistic and cultural movement that we'll talk about, that proclaimed a radically independent and vibrant concept of the African American. At Abyssinian Baptist, people held intimate and deeply integrated faith because, to quote Williams, Jesus was evidence that God knows suffering. African American spirituals molded Bonhoeffer's faith further, and his conversations with the brilliant French student, one Jean Lasserre, influenced Bonhoeffer's later writings on Christian obedience. Ultimately, Bonhoeffer's experience of the Harlem Renaissance convinced him that loyalty to Christ meant doing what Christ has done. So let's press on to Williams' second chapter for our third goal. Williams' big idea is that Bonhoeffer's new understanding of African Americans based in the Harlem Renaissance allowed him to develop a theology freed of the poison of white nationalism and racism that captivated the German National Socialist movement. That is, to use Williams's terms, the Harlem Renaissance shaped Bonhoeffer's theology into one of incarnation and empathy. I see that there are three parts to Williams' second chapter. First part, Williams describes the Great Migration northwards from the Deep South to Harlem between like the 1870s and the 1930s. So droves of people of color showed up in Harlem, fleeing from southern farm fields and the land of perpetual white terrorism. For many black folks, Harlem apparently became a beacon, where the fascinating new entity, the new Negro, came into fruition. This movement towards an authentic identity for black folks resulted in a proliferation of music, art, and literature that demonstrated a novel paradigm of blackness. This is crucial, folks. Williams is saying that black folks in the early 20th century in America were coming into themselves as a people in the same ways that Cohn, Quoke, and to some degree Tinker have already described for us in other contexts. This is cool. Into that profound, liberating social matrix came one Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the fall of 1930, an unwitting student of Harlem. Studying with professors like Richard Niebuhr, as well as Ward and Weber, Bonhoeffer took classes on literature, labor, and civil rights, and noticed significant disparities between the way that black men in higher education and white men in higher education were treated. So he was treated differently from his new friend Al Fisher. Williams observes that Bonhoeffer's new experiences of racism sharpened his social focus for his later work in Germany. Then things get really interesting. The second part of Williams's claim that the Harlem Renaissance influenced Bonhoeffer includes an observation that in 1930, Bonhoeffer went to visit Cuba, at a point when he was still in serious recovery from the toxic ethnocentric Christianity with which he had grown up. Scholars are not sure that Bonhoeffer even noticed the color line in Cuba, but around that same time, Bonhoeffer started reading black authors who taught him what Williams called social resistance. Williams asserts, drawing on Yale liberation theologian Willie Jennings, that European colonialism was and gave rise to a diseased social imagination. According to black pastor and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, the color line created by colonialism subjects people of color to whites-only power structures, structures that perpetuate the toxic racism to which Bonhoeffer was also subject. Williams asserts that the practice of a Christian faith can correct the abuses of colonial Christianity. Let's stop for a second to reinforce what Williams is saying. In Module 6, we've seen in Cohn that Jesus is a liberative figure for black people in particular. In Module 4, we also observed with Quoque-Lan the virulent way in which the patriarchy intertwines with race to denigrate or erase marginalized voices like those of people of color. Like Cohn, like Quoque, Williams is suggesting that Christianity can be a corrective for any theology or ideology that marginalizes one group of people and elevates another. And he's correct, because Jesus always stands with the outsider. This is what you folks need to do in your ministry to some degree. Part of your sharing the gospel of Christ, irrespective of your tasks in the church, is to share the ways in which the gospel can heal and free people of the evil of racism. Part of your ministry is to help folks recover from the lie that our culture tells us, that whiteness is normative and that every other skin color is deviant. Which all leads us to the cogent third part of Williams' second chapter, where he examines and critiques European colonialism at great depth. Williams observes that a Eurocentric vision of the world is off-center because it's predicated on the superiority of whiteness. He also digs into the racialization that motivated European colonial powers. These movements depended on a hierarchy of ethnicity with white at the top, a social paradigm seamlessly blended with the diseased myth that one race is better than another. According to Williams, that myth made Germany a barbarous world power at the time of the First World War. Plus, even though after the Second World War, people of color were invited into the democratic project, people who were black often did not have their voices fully heard in the struggle for democracy, and so many of them gravitated towards Marxism. Happily, Williams observes that in 1930, Bonhoeffer, under these influences, was about to embrace a novel theology that healthily integrated, ethnic difference. Which all leads us to what I hope is our quick fourth goal, our examination of Williams's third chapter, where you'll get to evaluate Williams' analyses of Du Bois's anti-racist credo, his parable Jesus Christ in Texas, and County Cullen's poem The Black Christ. According to Williams, the Jesus lifted up by faithful black intellectuals in the Harlem Renaissance, quote, decentered Europe and whiteness as a source of saving knowledge, end quote. Williams states that W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of the veil denotes the secret knowledge that black folks have of themselves apart from the mechanics of white racism. In his credo in particular, Du Bois asserts, "I believe that all men, black, brown, and white, are brothers." Williams concurs, contending that, quote, "racial and national loyalties are oppositional to authentic Christian witness." I agree. From what I can see, that's true. Belonging to Jesus means that we belong with all humanity, not just our families and cultures of origin. Plus, Du Bois pointedly uses the Sermon on the Mount in his credo to rebuke anti-black political stances by white politicians in his day. Moreover, in terms of Du Bois's parable Jesus Christ in Texas, Williams asks how the Savior might be received in the American South today. Williams observes that Du Bois's Jesus is incarnated as the prisoner and the stranger in that parable. The racist white colonel and his wife are upset, even outraged, by Jesus' olive skin and his direct questions that lampoon their prejudice. Moreover, just as we've seen in Cone and Quoke, Jesus takes the side of the marginalized person. He meets a runaway black convict in Waco, trades places with him, and is lynched alongside him by the authorities. As Williams retells it, Du Bois's parable is a scathing theological indictment of Eurocentric, racist policy and practice. Lastly, in terms of County Cullen's poem The Black Christ, Williams observes that the poet discounts organized Christianity as a reflex of white domination. So Jim, the young black man lynched and resurrected in the poem, embodies a mode of Christianity not co-opted by white racism. Even though Jim's older brother sees white Christianity as an opiate that dulls black rage, Jim, especially when he's resurrected, incarnates an integral faith that encompasses what Williams calls trust in the infinite wisdom of the Creator, a trust that looks beyond the lethal structures of white power to a world where God will create an anti-racist policy, a world that transcends racism. All this applies to Bonhoeffer, folks. All this applies to Bonhoeffer because he read all that literature when he was living and working in Harlem, and Williams argues that Du Bois, Cullen, and others helped to loosen the fetters of Bonhoeffer's Volk-inflected religion and to prepare him for his struggle against Nazism, a virulent strain of white nationalism within his own country. Bonhoeffer's struggles against racism can impact us, as we observe both the Black Lives Matter movement and the struggles for immigrants and refugees across the globe for agency and self-determination. Now, I recognize that that was very long. Pardon me. It was also very important. In this module, our thesis has been Bonhoeffer's theological transformation in Harlem provides an exemplar for racial reconciliation in our own day. Tried to make that clear in 4 far-reaching and dense ways in this video. First, you have established basic context for Reggie Williams and his subject Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Second, you've analyzed the difference that Williams sees between Bonhoeffer's Volk theology in his early period and the Bonhoeffer that emerged from Harlem in terms of his transformation. Third, you've at length interpreted Williams's argument concerning the ways that the Harlem Renaissance shaped Bonhoeffer's theology into one of incarnation and empathy. Fourth, you've evaluated Williams' analyses of Du Bois's short manifesto credo and his parable Jesus Christ in Texas, as well as Cullen's evocative and empathetic poem The Black Christ, in terms of their import for Bonhoeffer's new paradigm of racial reconciliation. That is more than enough of Williams for now. When you're ready, please go on to the next video.